Tonight, even the staff used to be part of my past, Daniel Brooks said into the microphone, his voice smooth and careless, the kind of confidence that came from thinking he had already won. And then the spotlight shifted, slow and deliberate, until it landed on Emily Carter standing beside table 12, a tray balanced in her hand, her posture straight, her expression calm, dressed in a simple black and white server uniform that made her look like she belonged anywhere but here. Not in this room filled with crystal glasses, tailored suits, and the soft hum of a celebration that was never meant for her, because tonight was his night, his wedding, his new beginning, and yet somehow he had chosen this place, this exact restaurant, to make sure she would see it, to make sure she would feel it, every second of it, and the guests followed his gaze, curious at first, then amused as whispers moved like a breeze through the room, recognizing the story without needing to hear it. The ex-wife turned waitress, the woman who lost everything now serving drinks at the man who replaced her. And Emily didn't move, didn't flinch, just stepped forward when Sophia Lane lifted her glass with a small, expectant smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "Excuse me," Sophia said lightly, tilting her head as if Emily were invisible and inconvenient at the same time. "This champagne is warm," and Emily nodded once, her voice soft but steady. "I'll bring a fresh bottle right away," as if nothing in that sentence carried history, as if her name had never once been Carter Brooks. As if she hadn't stood beside Daniel years ago in a much smaller kitchen, sleeves rolled up, laughing over burnt sauce and unpaid bills, believing that building something together meant it would last. But that memory didn't exist here, not tonight, not in this version of the story, because here she was just staff, just someone who refilled glasses and cleared plates, someone replaceable, someone small. And Sophia reached into her clutch, pulled out a crisp bill, and slid it onto the tray with a faint smirk. "Keep the change," she added, her tone gentle enough to sound polite but sharp enough to cut, and a few guests chuckled under their breath, watching, waiting for a reaction, for something to crack, for Emily to show even a flicker of what this must feel like. But she didn't give them that, she simply glanced at the bill, then back at Sophia and said, "Of course, ma'am," before turning away, her steps even, her shoulders relaxed, as if the weight of the room wasn't pressing down on her at all, and behind her, Daniel laughed quietly, satisfied, raising his glass again like he had just proven a point no one had asked him to make, unaware that not everything in this room was what it seemed, unaware that the night wasn't unfolding the way he thought it was, unaware that Emily Carter had never once come here by accident. The kitchen doors swung open and closed in a steady rhythm, letting out brief flashes of heat and the sharp scent of garlic and butter, and Emily moved through it all like she had done 1,000 times before, her steps precise, her hands steady, her face untouched by the noise behind her, but her mind drifting somewhere quieter, somewhere years back when this place had not been filled with strangers but with hope, when the walls had still been unfinished and Daniel had stood beside her with sleeves rolled up, sketching ideas on a scrap of paper, promising that one day this restaurant would be theirs, not his, not hers, but theirs, a place built on long nights and shared dreams, and she remembered the way he used to look at her then, like she was part of the future, like she mattered. Until success came faster than loyalty and the dream shifted shape, contracts replacing conversations, meetings replacing dinners, and one day she had been asked to sign papers she had not fully understood, legal language wrapped around trust, and she had signed because she believed in him, because she believed in them, and that was the day her name quietly disappeared from everything they had built, replaced, erased, reduced to a memory that only she seemed to carry, and now here she was again walking the same floor, but no longer as a partner, no longer as a wife, just another server in a room full of people who thought they knew her story without ever asking. And as she reached the service station, she set down the empty tray and picked up a fresh bottle of champagne, her fingers brushing briefly against the label. A small pause that no one noticed, not even the line cook who passed behind her and murmured something under his breath that sounded like, "Yes, ma'am," before catching himself and looking away, and Emily did not react, not to the slip, not to the respect that surfaced only when no one was watching, because some things were not meant to be seen. Yet, and she returned to the dining room just as Daniel's laughter rose again above the soft music, his voice carrying easily, confidently, telling a story about how far he had come, how some people simply could not keep up, and a few guests nodded, impressed, entertained, unaware that the woman refilling their glasses had once been the one keeping everything together when there had been nothing to show off. And Sophia leaned closer to Daniel, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her smile polished and perfect, the picture of a life that looked effortless from the outside. And when Emily stepped up to the table again, pouring the champagne with careful precision, Sophia glanced at her briefly, her eyes scanning, measuring, as if trying to place something she could not quite define. And for a moment there was a flicker of uncertainty, something almost like recognition, but it passed quickly, replaced by the same quiet superiority, the same assumption that this was exactly where Emily belonged, and Daniel did not even look at her this time, not directly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge her presence without giving it weight, as if she had already been categorized and dismissed. And Emily finished pouring, her movements smooth, controlled, every gesture deliberate, and when she stepped back, the room continued exactly as before, the music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, everything moving forward as if nothing underneath it was shifting, as if the foundation of the night was not already beginning to crack in ways no one could yet see. And near the entrance, the manager, Mr. Lewis, stood quietly observing, his posture formal, his expression neutral, but when Emily passed by him, just for a fraction of a second, he lowered his head in a subtle, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture so small it disappeared the moment it happened, unnoticed by every guest in the room, unnoticed by Daniel, unnoticed by Sophia, but not unnoticed by Emily, and she did not return the nod, not because she did not see it, but because she did not need to, because everything that mattered was already in place, and tonight was not about proving anything out loud, it was about timing. And Emily Carter had learned the hard way that the most powerful moments were the ones that arrived without warning. The laughter grew louder as the night settled deeper into itself, glasses refilled, conversations loosening, and the air thick with the kind of celebration that only existed when people believed they were witnessing success. And Emily moved between tables with the same quiet precision, her presence blending into the background while her awareness caught every detail, every glance, every careless word that floated just above the surface. And at table 12, Daniel leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over it, his confidence expanding with each passing minute as if the room itself confirmed everything he believed about his life, about his choices, about the version of the story he had rewritten to suit him. And Sophia tilted her head toward one of the guests, her voice light but sharp enough to carry. "It is funny how some people never really move on," she said, her eyes flicking briefly toward Emily before returning to her glass. And a few people smiled politely, unsure if they were meant to laugh, while others did, quietly, because it was easier to follow the tone than to question it. And Emily approached again, placing a fresh dish at the center of the table, her hands steady, her movements controlled, as if the moment did not belong to her at all. And Daniel finally looked at her directly, not long, just long enough to let the weight of recognition settle in. "You are still here," he said, almost amused, as if he had expected her to disappear entirely. And Emily met his gaze for a brief second, not challenging, not defensive, just present. "I am," she replied simply, her voice even, offering nothing more, nothing less, and that answer seemed to unsettle him more than any reaction could have, because it carried no apology, no regret, no trace of the past he thought defined her. And Sophia reached for her glass again, tapping it lightly against the table. "Can we get better service?" she added, her tone sweet but edged. "It is a special night." And Emily nodded once, "Of course," before turning away again, leaving behind a silence that did not quite resolve itself. And as she moved toward the service station, the rhythm of the evening continued, but something subtle had shifted, something small but persistent, like a note slightly off in an otherwise perfect melody. And behind the scenes, staff moved with quiet efficiency, but every so often, a glance followed Emily, a brief acknowledgement, a recognition that stayed unspoken, because not everything needed to be said out loud to be understood. And near the bar, Mr. Lewis adjusted his cuff, his posture still formal, but his attention never straying far from Emily, watching the timing, the flow, the progression of the night as if he were waiting for something, or perhaps ensuring that everything unfolded exactly as it was meant to. And back at the table, Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly as he spoke to his guests. "You have to know when to let things go," he said, shaking his head with a faint smile. "Some people hold on to the past because it is all they have left." And this time the laughter came easier, more certain, the room aligning itself with his version of reality, reinforcing it, strengthening it, while Emily stood just a few steps away, hearing every word without reacting, without breaking the rhythm of her work. And when she picked up an empty glass, her fingers paused for the briefest moment, not out of hesitation but out of control, The kind that came from knowing more than anyone else in the room, the kind that did not rush, did not reveal, did not need to defend itself. And as she carried the tray back toward the kitchen, the lights above the dining area reflected softly against the polished floor, creating a quiet shimmer beneath her steps, a subtle reminder that what appeared stable on the surface was often supported by something deeper, something unseen, and tonight, that unseen foundation belonged to her, even if no one at that table understood it yet, even if Daniel continued to speak as though the story had already ended, because Emily Carter was no longer part of the version he told, and that was exactly why he could not see what was coming next. The night carried on with a steady rhythm, but beneath the polished surface, Emily's world moved on an entirely different timeline, one that had begun long before this evening, long before the laughter, long before Daniel ever decided to return here, as if he still owned the narrative. And as she stepped into the quieter corridor behind the dining room, the noise softened into a distant murmur, replaced by the hum of refrigeration units and the faint clatter of dishes being cleaned, and for a moment everything felt still, controlled, hers and her reflection caught in the narrow mirror by the service station. Not glamorous, not decorated, just composed, deliberate, and it reminded her of mornings that used to begin before sunrise, when the restaurant had been nothing more than an empty space with bare floors and a single folding table, when she had stood there with a cup of cheap coffee in her hand, mapping out ideas while Daniel talked about expansion, about scale, about how they would turn something small into something impossible to ignore, and she had believed him, not because of the words, but because she believed in the work, in the hours, in the quiet determination that built things from nothing. And when everything started to grow faster than expected, she had stayed behind the scenes, managing operations, balancing numbers, solving problems before they became visible, while Daniel stepped forward, becoming the face, the voice, the one people remembered, and she had not minded then because she thought they were moving forward together, until the meetings changed, until decisions were made without her, until documents appeared with language she was told not to worry about, until trust slowly turned into distance, and distance turned into absence, and absence into something final, something signed and sealed, leaving her outside of the very place she had helped bring to life. And yet she had not fought, not loudly, not publicly, she had simply stepped away, taking with her everything she had learned, every detail, every weakness, every possibility that others overlooked, and she rebuilt quietly, deliberately, starting with long shifts at other restaurants, learning from the inside out, understanding not just how to run a business but how to own one, how to protect it, how to structure it in ways that could not be easily taken or erased, and over time opportunity presented itself not as a sudden miracle, but as a series of small precise openings, investors looking to exit, shares available through channels no one paid attention to, and she moved through them carefully, never using her name, never drawing attention, until the numbers shifted, until ownership no longer sat where people assumed it did, until the foundation changed hands without the building itself ever noticing. And tonight, as she adjusted the cuff of her sleeve and stepped back toward the dining room, everything aligned with that quiet progression, every step leading here, not for confrontation, not for revenge in the way people expected, but for something steadier, something that did not need to announce itself to be real. And as she re-entered the glow of the chandeliers, the sound of laughter returning. Around her, Daniel was in the middle of another story, his voice confident, uninterrupted, and Sophia leaned close beside him, her presence polished, composed, unaware that the space around her was no longer what she believed it to be. And Emily moved past them once more, her expression unchanged, her pace unhurried, carrying with her a certainty that did not come from proving anything to anyone in that room, but from knowing that every detail, every decision, every silent step she had taken, had already reshaped the outcome of this night, even if the moment of recognition had not yet arrived. And somewhere near the entrance, Mr. Lewis glanced at the clock, then toward Emily, a subtle exchange without words, a shared understanding that timing mattered more than anything else, and Emily gave no signal in return, no nod, no acknowledgement, because she did not need to, because she had already learned that the strongest position was the one that revealed itself only when it could no longer be denied. And as the evening continued, the distance between what everyone believed and what was actually true grew thinner with every passing second. By the time dessert was served, the atmosphere had settled into something softer, more indulgent, the kind of late evening comfort where people stopped paying attention to details and started believing everything they saw was exactly as it appeared. And that was when Emily noticed the shift she had been waiting for. Not in the room itself but in Daniel, because confidence, when stretched too far, always began to reveal its edges, and he leaned back again, glass in hand, his voice carrying just enough to command attention without asking for it, talking about expansion, about future plans, about acquiring new locations, and this time he gestured around the room as if the space itself were already part of his next move. Places like this, he said casually, they are nice, but they can be better with the right leadership. And a few guests nodded, impressed, while others glanced around as if imagining the transformation he described, unaware of how misplaced that assumption was, and Sophia smiled beside him, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. We have been looking at a few properties, she added, her tone smooth, confident. Something with potential, something we can elevate. And her eyes drifted briefly across the room before landing on Emily again, just for a second longer this time, as if trying to understand why her presence felt so constant, so steady, despite everything that had been said and implied. And Emily stepped forward once more, clearing plates, her movements unhurried, unaffected, as if the conversation unfolding inches away from her carried no weight at all, and that was what made it unsettling, because she did not react the way people expected someone in her position to react. She did not shrink, she did not rush, she did not avoid eye contact, she simply existed within the moment with a quiet control that did not match the role she appeared to play, and Daniel noticed it, not fully, not consciously, but enough to create a flicker of irritation beneath his composed exterior, and he set his glass down with a soft but deliberate sound. You know, he said, directing his words more clearly now, loyalty matters in business, but so does knowing when to move on from what no longer works. And there. It was again the subtle insistence on defining the past in a way that justified the present, the need to reshape history into something that supported his version of success. And for the first time that night, Emily paused just long enough to meet his gaze again, not challenging, not emotional, just steady, and in that brief exchange there was something Daniel could not quite place, not recognition, not regret, but something closer to uncertainty, something that did not belong in the narrative he had built, and it passed quickly, replaced by the comfort of the room, the laughter, the agreement of those around him, and Emily turned away once more, carrying the tray back toward the service station, where the noise of the dining room softened again, replaced by the controlled rhythm of staff who knew exactly what they were doing, and as she set the tray down, one of the younger servers glanced at her, hesitated, then said quietly, "Everything is ready when you are," before quickly returning to his work, and Emily gave the smallest nod, barely visible, because nothing about this night required urgency, nothing needed to be rushed, and across the room Mr. Lewis checked the time again, his posture unchanged, his expression neutral, but his attention sharpened, and when he looked up, his eyes met Emily's across the distance, just for a second, a silent confirmation that the moment they had both been waiting for was approaching. Not with noise, not with confrontation, but with the kind of quiet precision that could not be interrupted once it began. And back at the table, Daniel reached for his wallet without thinking, a casual gesture, a habit formed from countless dinners where the ending was simple, predictable, entirely under his control, and he placed it beside his plate, unaware that this time, the final act of the evening would not belong to him at all. The final course had been cleared, the last glasses refilled just enough to stretch the evening a little longer, and the energy in the room shifted into that quiet pause where everything began to wind down, where conversations softened and people leaned back in their chairs, satisfied, unaware that the most important moment had not happened yet, and Emily stood near the service station, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter, her posture relaxed but intentional, watching, without appearing to watch, feeling the exact second the night tipped toward its ending, and across the room Daniel reached for the check folder that had just been placed beside his plate, his movement casual, automatic, the kind of gesture that carried no weight because it had never once been questioned, and he opened it with a faint smile still lingering from the conversation, glancing down for less than a second before sliding his card inside without hesitation, as if the number did not matter, as if the act itself was the point, a final statement of control, and he placed it back on the table with a light tap, leaning back again as though the night had already concluded in his favor, while Sophia adjusted her bracelet and glanced around the room, her expression satisfied, her attention already drifting toward what came next, and for a moment everything held still, the music, the lighting, the soft hum of voices blending into a single, unremarkable ending, until Mr. Lewis stepped forward, his pace measured, his expression composed, moving toward the table with the same professional calm he had maintained all evening. And Emily did not move, did not follow, she simply remained where she was, her gaze steady, her breathing even, because this part did not belong to her actions anymore. It belonged to timing, to precision, to the quiet alignment of everything she had set in motion long before tonight began. And Mr. Lewis reached the table, offering a polite nod as he picked up the folder. "Thank you, sir," he said evenly, his tone respectful but firm, and Daniel gave a small, dismissive nod in return, barely looking up, already assuming the outcome, already moving past the moment as if it held no significance, and Mr. Lewis opened the folder, his eyes scanning briefly before closing it again with the same controlled motion, and there was a pause, not long, not obvious, but just enough to interrupt the rhythm of expectation, just enough to create a subtle shift in the air that only a few people noticed at first, and Daniel glanced up, faint irritation flickering across his expression at the delay. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone light but edged, and Mr. Lewis met his gaze calmly, his posture unchanged. "No problem at all, sir," he replied, his voice steady, carrying just enough to reach the nearby tables, and then without raising his tone, without changing his expression, he added, "However, this bill has already been taken care of." And the words settled into the space like something heavier than their simplicity suggested, and for a brief second Daniel did not react, as if his mind needed to catch up to what had just been said, as if the statement did not fit into the pattern he expected, and Sophia frowned slightly, her attention snapping back. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice sharper now, the first crack in her composed exterior, and Mr. Lewis inclined his head slightly, still calm, still precise. "The entire evening has been covered," he said, pausing just enough before continuing, "by the owner." And this time the silence that followed was unmistakable, not soft, not subtle, but complete, spreading outward from the table as conversation slowed and then stopped entirely, as eyes turned, as the meaning of those words began to settle in, and Daniel's hand, still resting near his wallet, remained frozen, his expression shifting, not yet understanding but no longer certain. And across the room, Emily stood exactly where she had been all along, her posture unchanged, her presence quiet, but no longer invisible, because now, for the first time that night, the story he believed in no longer matched the reality unfolding in front of him. The silence did not break all at once, it stretched, thin and fragile, as if the entire room was holding its breath without realizing it, and Daniel's fingers slowly pulled back from the edge of the table, his expression tightening in a way that no longer matched the confidence he had carried all evening, because this was not part of the script he believed in, this was not how the ending was supposed to unfold, and he let out a short, controlled breath, attempting to recover the tone he had maintained. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice measured but no longer effortless, and Mr. Lewis did not move, did not adjust, did not offer apology or correction. He simply stood there with the same calm authority. "There is no mistake, sir," he replied, his words clear, leaving no room for interpretation, and Sophia leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as she glanced between the manager and the check folder, then back at Daniel. "Who would cover something like this?" she asked, her voice lower now, more cautious than before. And Mr. Lewis paused just long enough for the question to settle, just long enough for every nearby table to lean closer without appearing to, and then he answered, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a precision that carried further than any raised voice could have. "The owner," he said again, and this time there was no mistaking the direction of his gaze because it shifted, slow and deliberate, across the room until it landed on Emily, and it did not move away, not immediately, not subtly, but long enough for everyone else to follow it, long enough for the meaning to take shape in real time, and Daniel turned his head, not quickly, not sharply, but with a hesitation that revealed something deeper than confusion, something closer to disbelief, as his eyes found Emily standing near the service station, exactly where she had been all night, unchanged, composed, no longer hidden by the assumptions that had defined her just moments before, and the room adjusted around that realization, not with noise, but with a shift in presence, as if the space itself had realigned, and Sophia's expression faltered for the first time, her polished composure giving way to a flicker of uncertainty. "That is not possible," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else, because the idea did not fit, it did not align with what she believed about the situation, about the roles everyone was supposed to play, And yet the evidence stood in front of her, undeniable in its stillness, and Daniel's gaze did not leave Emily, searching her face for something familiar. Something that would explain this without forcing him to reconsider. Everything else, he began, the word incomplete, suspended between past and present, and Emily met his eyes, not with triumph, not with anger, but with a calm that carried more weight than either, a calm that came from knowing she did not need to explain anything for it to be real, and she did not step forward, did not speak, did not change her posture, because this moment did not belong to her voice, it belonged to recognition, to the quiet collapse of a narrative that could no longer hold itself together, and around them, the guests watched, no longer amused, no longer certain, their earlier laughter replaced by a silence that felt heavier now, more deliberate, as if they were witnessing something they had not been invited to understand, and Mr. Lewis remained at the table, his role complete but his presence steady, reinforcing what had already been revealed without needing to repeat it, and Daniel's hand slowly moved away from his wallet, the gesture small but final, as if letting go of something he had assumed was always his to control, and for the first time that night, he was not the center of the room, not the one directing the tone, not the one defining the story, because Emily Carter, without raising her voice, without stepping out of place, had shifted everything simply by existing in the truth he had chosen to ignore, and the distance between who he thought she was and who she had become was no longer hidden in the background, it stood directly in front of him, quiet, undeniable, and impossible to dismiss. The room did not return to normal after that moment, it shifted into something quieter, heavier, as if every person present had suddenly realized they were standing inside a story they did not fully understand, and Daniel remained seated but no longer relaxed, his posture stiff, his gaze fixed on Emily as though trying to reconcile the woman he once knew with the one standing across the room, and for the first time that night, he stood up slowly, not with confidence, not with performance, but with something closer to uncertainty. "Emily," he said, her name unfamiliar on his tongue now, like something that had lost its place in his world, and the sound of it carried through the silence, drawing every eye between them, and she did not move immediately, did not rush to meet him, she simply turned, setting down the tray she had been holding with quiet precision before stepping forward, each movement measured, unhurried, her expression calm in a way that did not invite confrontation or explanation, and Sophia watched closely, her composure tightening, her earlier confidence replaced by calculation, trying to understand how this shift affected her, what it meant for the position she believed she held, and as Emily approached the table, the distance between past and present narrowed into something tangible, something neither of them could ignore anymore, and Daniel exhaled slowly, searching for footing. "You own this place?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier certainty, and Emily met his gaze without hesitation, her answer simple. "Yes." Not defensive, not proud, just true, and the simplicity of it unsettled him more than any elaborate explanation could have, because it left no room to argue, no space to reshape it into something more comfortable, and Sophia leaned back slightly, crossing her arms, her voice controlled but edged. "That does not make sense," she said, her eyes narrowing. "We have been looking into this location for months," and Emily turned her attention to her briefly, her tone unchanged. "Then you already know how ownership works," she replied, not sharp, not dismissive, just precise, and the words settled with quiet finality, and Daniel ran a hand through his hair, the gesture small but revealing, a break in the composed image he had maintained. "Why did you not say anything?" he asked, and there was something in that question that carried more than confusion, something closer to expectation, as if he believed he was still entitled to an explanation, and Emily held his gaze for a moment before answering. There was nothing to say. And that was it, no added weight, no hidden emotion, just the truth as she understood it, and the absence of drama made it heavier, not lighter, because it showed that whatever existed between them before no longer defined her actions now. And around them, the guests remained silent, watching, not with amusement anymore, but with a kind of careful attention, aware that the balance of the room had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and Mr. Lewis stepped slightly back, giving space to the moment without removing himself from it, his presence still reinforcing the reality that had been revealed, and Daniel looked around briefly, as if searching for something familiar to anchor himself, but the room no longer responded to him. The same way the attention had moved, the center had shifted, and when his gaze returned to Emily, there was something quieter in it now, something that did not belong to the man who had raised his glass earlier in the night, And Emily did not press the moment, did not expand it, she simply stood there, composed, present, allowing the silence to settle where it needed to, because this was never about proving him wrong, it was about no longer needing to prove anything at all. And in that stillness it became clear that whatever control he believed he had walked in with had already slipped away long before he realized it, replaced by a reality he could not reshape. And Emily Carter did not need to claim it, because it was already hers. The silence lingered for a moment longer before it began to dissolve, not into laughter or noise, but into something quieter, something more careful, as if every person in the room understood that the night had already reached its real conclusion and everything after this was simply an echo of what had just been revealed. And Emily did not stay in that space any longer than necessary, she did not wait for apologies, did not look for reactions, did not claim the moment in any visible way, she simply turned, her movements as calm and deliberate as they had been all evening, and walked back toward the service station, not as someone retreating, but as someone returning to her place with full ownership of it. And Mr. Lewis straightened slightly as she passed, offering a subtle nod, deeper this time, no longer hidden, and she acknowledged it with the smallest glance, a quiet confirmation that needed no words. And behind her, Daniel remained, standing, his posture uncertain, his gaze following her as if he was trying to understand how everything had shifted without him noticing, how the version of her he had carried in his mind no longer existed in front of him. And Sophia broke the silence first, her voice controlled but no longer steady. "We should go," she said, not looking at anyone in particular, her focus already moving away from the table, from the room, from the discomfort that had settled in around her. And Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding, a small, almost automatic response, and as they gathered their things, the attention of the room shifted again, not with judgment, not with open reaction, but with a quiet awareness that something significant had just taken place, something that would be remembered differently by everyone who witnessed it. And as Daniel turned toward the exit, he paused briefly, glancing back one last time, his eyes finding Emily across the room, and for a moment, there was something unspoken there, not regret exactly, not understanding, but something closer to realization, the kind that arrives too late to change anything. And Emily did not hold that gaze, she did not need to, she simply continued what she had been doing, adjusting a glass, speaking quietly to a staff member, her presence steady, unaffected by whether he stayed or left, and that was what made the difference complete, because she was no longer defined by his attention, no longer shaped by his choices. And as the door closed behind them, the room exhaled, conversation slowly returning, the soft music filling the space again. But something had changed in the way people looked at her now, not with curiosity, not with pity, but with a quiet respect that did not ask questions. And Emily moved through the room one last time, her steps light, her expression composed, until she reached the edge of the dining area where the lights softened into shadow, and she paused there for just a second, looking out over the space she had built, the space she had reclaimed without ever needing to raise her voice. And then she reached up, unclipped the small name tag from her uniform, and set it down on the counter beside her, not as a rejection of where she had been standing, but as a simple acknowledgement that she no longer needed to stand there at all. And she turned, walking toward the private hallway that led away from the dining room, her figure disappearing gradually into the quieter part of the building, leaving behind a room that no longer belonged to the version of her anyone had tried to define. And the night continued, but not for her, because she had already stepped beyond it, and without a word, without a scene, without anything that could be called revenge, Emily Carter had taken back everything that mattered, not from him, but for herself, and that was something no one in that room would ever forget.